I don't think I can overstate how prophetic these times are. I mean, we likely just witnessed the prophetic fulfillment of Jeremiah 49 with the attack on Iran, where we took out their leader, their modern day Haman, which, may I remind you, began on February 28th, on the day of Purim, according to the Essene calendar, not the modern day Jewish calendar. Now we are approaching the beginning of the final Jubilee period on the Essene calendar, the 120th Jubilee since creation. That number in and of itself is prophetic. This is taking place on March 18th of this year, this month. And we're left wondering, is all of this connected? I think the timing of the decapitation of Iran's leadership, the modern day Haman from scripture, on the day of Purim. Now, for context, you can watch my last video or read the book of Esther. But I think these events give even more credence to the validity of the Essene calendar and its timeline of human history. But I don't think we can just rely on these events to know whether the Essene calendar is in fact a prophetic roadmap for us. I think we need more. So now I want us to look deeper at scripture to see if we can trust this calendar system and that these events are not just flukes. Now, for those of you who may be lost on this subject, I'll give a quick synopsis at the top of everything we're talking about. So let's jump in. And don't be alarmed if I change outfits during the video. No, it's not magic. I just taped it on 2 separate occasions. In my last video, we looked at the Essene calendar, the calendar system preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what it says about where we are in human history. When author and researcher Dr. Ken Johnson calculated this calendar against our Gregorian calendar, he found something absolutely amazing, that it points to March 18th, 2026 as the beginning of the final Jubilee cycle. What does that mean? Well, the Essenes also referred to a Jubilee cycle as a generation, a 50-year period that includes 7 7-year periods, and a final year called a Jubilee year that ushered in restoration and redemption. And according to Ken Johnson's interpretation of this calendar, this would be the last one in a 6,000-year span of exactly 120 Jubilee cycles before ushering in the return of Christ and his final millennial reign, a 1,000-year period capping off 7,000 years of human history. In fact, many ancient Jews and church fathers believed all of human history would mirror the 6 days of creation and the final Sabbath rest. It was a prominent belief that God allotted this 6,000 years of man to rule before establishing his reign on earth, and he intended his creation framework of 7 days as a prophetic shadow of that. As we read in Psalm 90 verse 4, "For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past." And 2 Peter 3:8, "But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day." We also covered how this new Jubilee cycle, based on the biblical patterns surrounding it, could bring about some very significant prophetic events in the next couple of years, because history has shown that major prophetic events often take place at the beginning of a new Jubilee cycle, according to Ken Johnson's mapping of this calendar system. Now, I want to be upfront about this video that I'm trying to do. I'm not setting dates here, okay, for all of you who just choose to click on a video, comment, and not actually watch the video. I never set dates, okay? I never do. I'm just watching the seasons, okay? But what I want to explore here is more of a foundational question. Can we actually trust this calendar? And if so, what does it mean for us today? First, is there anything in Scripture itself that would give us reason to believe the Dead Sea Scroll calendar is reliable? Something God may have intentionally preserved for a generation like ours? I think the answer is yes, and I think Scripture makes a stronger case for it than most people realize. Okay, so real quickly, who were the Essenes? They were a Jewish sect responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. They operated on a 364-day solar calendar they believed was given by God at creation. And this calendar was built around several repeating cycles. We had Shemitas, which are 7-year periods, and Jubilees, which are 50-year periods. There's also Onas, which are 500-year periods, and Ages, which are 2,000 years. And you have 3 ages and a final millennial reign to make up 7,000 years. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Using their system and a specific scroll known as 11Q13, the Essenes calculated that the Messiah would come and die for sin exactly one Shemitah after the end of their 9th Jubilee. When you convert that to the modern calendar, it lands on 32 AD, which lines up precisely with the date many believe to be the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It appears they were right. And there were many other prophecies they predicted as well. And for that, I recommend you check out Dr. Ken Johnson's YouTube channel. But this matters a lot because the same calendar is now pointing to something in our own generation. Here's the question I want us to sit with. What if the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was something the Bible actually anticipated? Because when you look carefully at what Daniel and Isaiah wrote in the Old Testament and then hold it up against what happened in recent history, the convergence, it's hard to explain away. Let's walk through it, okay? First, let's go to Daniel 12:4. Now, to understand this passage, you need a little context, okay? Daniel 12 is the closing chapter of many of Daniel's prophecies about the end times. And it deals specifically with events at the end of days, a time of tribulation, resurrection, and final judgment. Now, after receiving all of this revelation, Daniel is given one final instruction. An angel tells him, "But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." There are two things happening here that we need to understand. First, Daniel is told to seal his writings, to deliberately close them up, presumably because the full meaning wouldn't be unlocked until the appointed time. And second, he's given a sign of when that time would arrive. Many would run to and fro, and knowledge would be increased. Now, that phrase, run to and fro, is often misunderstood, and there's much debate about what it means. The common interpretation treats it as a reference to the modern world. Planes, trains, the internet, the explosion of information, and honestly, there is something to that. But the Hebrew verb used here carries a deeper meaning. It means to rove or range over something intently, like eyes moving back and forth across a text. And there's a significant portion of biblical scholarship, specifically among Jewish interpreters, that reads this as people searching the scriptures, running back and forth through sacred writings, seeking understanding of things that had previously been hidden or sealed. In other words, Daniel may be describing a generation that would furiously search through these ancient texts once they were finally unsealed, and in the process, find knowledge that had been locked away for centuries. Now think about what happened after 1947. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered and eventually made available to scholars, the academic world descended on them with absolute intensity. Researchers have spent decades running to and fro through those texts, and what emerged from all that searching includes the Essene calendar, now pointing to March 18, 2026 as when the final Jubilee cycle begins. Now let's look at Isaiah 29, because I think Isaiah is describing the same prophetic moment, but from a completely different angle. And he adds a detail that Daniel doesn't quite give. Isaiah 29, in its original context, is a judgment prophecy directed at Jerusalem. God is rebuking his people for a kind of empty religion, going through all the outward motions of worship while their hearts were somewhere else entirely. Because of it, the city would face severe judgment. It would be brought low, besieged, and humbled to the dust. But then the prophecy pivots toward restoration. God promises to scatter Jerusalem's enemies and redeem his people. Dr. Ken Johnson argues that this chapter is doing something interesting. It's tracking two specific sequential moments in history. So to understand it, you need to know that Jerusalem was destroyed twice in history, once by the Babylonians and once by the Romans. Johnson points out that Isaiah 29 verses 1 through 3 is specifically describing the Roman destruction, not the Babylonian one, because the text describes the entire city being brought down, not just the temple. When Rome sieged Jerusalem in 70 AD, this was not some sort of partial judgment. The city was leveled. The people, they were scattered. The nation was effectively dissolved. God used the Roman army as a single unified force to bring the full weight of that judgment on Israel. Now, with that context in place, look at what Isaiah says in verse 4. "And thou shalt be brought down, and shalt speak out of the ground, and thy speech shall be low out of the dust, and thy voice shall be as of one that hath a familiar spirit, out of the ground, and thy speech shall whisper out of the dust." Johnson interprets this as a direct prophetic picture of the Dead Sea Scrolls. As the Romans closed in and the Jewish people were being sent into exile, the Essenes, they buried their records and writings in the Judean hills. Those ancient voices remained silent in the ground for nearly 2,000 years. waiting for the moment they could speak to a later generation. That is the whispering out of the dust Isaiah describes. But then the prophecy shifts. In verses 5 through 8, the tone changes entirely. It says, "Moreover, the multitude of thy strangers shall be like small dust, and the multitude of the terrible ones shall be as chaff that passeth away. It shall be at an instant suddenly. Thou shalt be visited of the Lord of hosts with thunder, and with earthquake, and great noise, with storm and tempest, and the flame of devouring fire. And the multitude of all the nations that fight against Ariel, even all that fight against her and her munition, and that distress her, shall be as a dream of a night vision." So Johnson identifies this as pointing to 1948. Where the Roman destruction involved God using an army against Israel's judgment, the 1948 conflict, that was the opposite. God was with Israel against a multitude of nations. We know that 7 surrounding nations attacked suddenly, yet they were defeated, as Isaiah puts it, like chaff that passes away. Unlike Rome, which was one identified force bringing punishment, 1948 involved multiple nations that came against a reborn Israel, and they failed. It's at this point, the return of the Jewish people to their land and the simultaneous discovery of the scrolls and them being dug up from the dust, that Johnson connects back to Daniel 12:4. The scrolls surfacing triggered exactly what Daniel described, an increase of knowledge and the beginning of the running to and fro through these ancient texts. According to Johnson, this marks the official start of what Daniel called the time of the end. What makes this interpretation even more compelling is that it isn't a modern invention. Irenaeus, a church father writing around 170 AD, interpreted Daniel 12:4 in almost exactly this same way, nearly 1900 years ago. Now, his credentials are worth noting. Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who himself was a disciple of the Apostle John. That puts him just 2 generations removed from the apostles. Now, Irenaeus wrote that the hidden knowledge of Daniel's prophecies would only be fully understood at that time when the dispersion will be accomplished. Ken Johnson identifies the dispersion as the period following the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135 AD, when the Jewish people were scattered for nearly 1800 years. According to Irenaeus, when the Jews finally returned from that dispersion, the truth would be understood and knowledge would be complete. Here's where it gets really interesting. Listen to Ken Johnson talk about the seemingly prophetic timing of the transition of the Dead Sea Scrolls into Jewish hands. This is amazing.
So let me tell you basically the story of what happened, and I know you've heard this, but there was a guy, Yarden. He's a professor. He knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls. He wanted to get them. They were asking a high price for them. So he had to wait until the university got funds to be able to do that. He finally gets the funds, and this is his story. So he gets in his vehicle, and he's going to go down, find the person, pay him the money, get the scroll, or scrolls, or whatever, and then bring it back to the university. So he sets out that morning, he goes down, he does find the person, buys the scroll. He turns around to bring it back, and realizes he can't get back. Apparently, Israel has just declared itself to be a nation, and a war has started. And he doesn't dare take a piece of paper that's thousands of years old, that he's paid thousands of dollars for, anywhere near a war front. So he takes it elsewhere until after the war. But that's an interesting story. So basically what we're saying here is the Dead Sea Scrolls came into the hand of the Israelis, or began the very day that the war occurred, which was within a few days that the Lord made it like it was a bad dream. So this prophecy here is an amazing one, and it's actually taken place. The one other thing I'd mention is really cool. The very first scroll that Professor Yarden was bringing up, that he turned aside, that scroll was the scroll of Isaiah. It contained this prophecy in it. And I've often wondered if Isaiah, when he wrote this, knew how it would be fulfilled. And did he know that it was his specific prophecy that would be the fulfillment of this prophecy? Maybe, maybe not, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
These ancient writings were passing into Jewish hands at the exact moment the Jewish people were reclaiming their land after nearly 2,000 years of exile. Therefore, the sealed book was returned to a people in the very act of national rebirth. Amazing stuff. Now, you don't have to call that a definitive prophetic fulfillment to recognize that the timing is extraordinary. But when you do put it alongside Daniel 12:4, it gets really interesting. Daniel said a book would be sealed until the time of the end. Isaiah described a sealed book and voices rising from the dust in the context of Israel's restoration. It seems both are pointing to the same type of event. And 1947 and 1948 appear to be exactly what we're talking about here. I don't know. It's very interesting. So can we trust the calendar? Well, the question isn't just whether an ancient calendar says March 18, 2026 is significant. There have been many calendars that have come and gone that have had specific dates. I mean, I just right now thinking back to 2012 and the Mayan calendar, right? The deeper question is whether we have biblical reason to believe these scrolls were preserved on purpose, sealed in the earth, and returned to the world at precisely the moment God intended. If Daniel 12:4 is describing the unsealing of ancient writings at the end of days and people running to and fro to understand them, and Isaiah 29 is picturing those writings emerging from the ground as Israel is restored as a nation, then the Dead Sea Scrolls are a prophetically timed revelation, hidden, preserved, and unlocked at the right moment. And if that's true, then the calendar those scrolls contain, the same calendar that accurately pointed to the year of Christ's crucifixion, deserves to be taken seriously when it points to our generation. Now, once again, okay, I have to say this is not about setting dates. It's about recognizing that we may be the generation Daniel and Isaiah were writing about, and that we may be the generation that Jesus spoke about when saying that this generation will not pass until all these things take place. So if the scrolls were prophetically preserved and the calendar they contain is pointing to our generation, how should we respond to that? I think we'd be wise to do so with the kind of awareness Jesus expected from people who knew their scriptures. Because he made clear that knowing the Bible and recognizing the season you're living in are not the same thing. Jesus addressed this kind of blindness directly. In Matthew 16:2-3, he turns to the Pharisees and Sadducees, men who knew their scriptures probably better than anyone at their time, and he says this: "When it is evening, ye say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning it will be foul weather today. For the sky is red and lowering. O ye hypocrites, ye can discern the face of the sky, but can ye not discern the signs of the times?" This rebuke is not about missing a specific date. It was more so that they were completely unaware of the season they were living in, even though the signs were right in front of them. I mean, Jesus Christ, the Messiah, was speaking to them, and they didn't even realize it. That's the warning I think we need to take seriously. The Essene calendar proved its accuracy once already. It pointed to the Messiah's death with precision if we are understanding this calendar correctly. That same system is now pointing to the beginning of the final Jubilee cycle beginning here in 2026. Again, we are not setting a date here, but we are, I think, watching a season arrive. Anyway, that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's video, please do me a favor, like, subscribe, share, and in the meantime, take care and God bless.